So far in this class, we've talked about how Europe underwent great religious change during the Protestant Reformation. We've also talked about how absolutism and constitutionalism challenged each other for what kind of government the nations of Europe would have. During the 15 and 1600s, Europe also underwent a lot of intellectual change. The two biggest movements are known as the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Sometimes this period, the 15 and 1600s, is also called the Age of Reason, and it also spills over into the 1700s. So today we're going to talk about those things, the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. So if you'd like to follow along, this is Lecture 8, the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment. Okay. So the Scientific Revolution took place roughly from the years 1540 to 1690, and then the Enlightenment from 1690 until the start of the French Revolution in 1789. The French Revolution is usually seen as the end of the Enlightenment. Okay, what is the Scientific Revolution? It's just the emergence of modern science in the mid-16th century. It included advancements in mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, and chemistry. Some historians have seen the Scientific Revolution as the real origin of both the modern world and the modern mentality. So this kind of brings us out of the Middle Ages into the modern world. The Enlightenment is the influential intellectual and cultural movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries. It introduced new worldview based on the use of reason, the scientific method, and progress. And we'll kind of talk about each of these. All right, before the scientific revolution, the term science didn't really exist like we use it today. That came into play in the 19th century using the term science. Back in the day, they would have called science natural philosophy. That's just the early modern term for the study of nature of the universe, its purpose, how the universe functions. So that's kind of what we would call science today. So natural philosophy is science. Now, early in the 16th century, natural philosophy is based on a few things. It's based on the thoughts of Aristotle, who was the Greek philosopher in the 4th century BC. It's based on Ptolemy, a Greek scholar who lived in the 1st and 2nd century AD. And then Thomas Aquinas, who was a medieval theologian. He basically harmonized Aristotelian ideas, that is, the ideas of Aristotle, with Christianity. So basically, natural philosophy is based on blending Greek philosophy and Christian theology. That's kind of what people's worldview in Europe is based on. A motionless Earth sits at the center of the universe, according to this old view. It's encircled by 10 crystal spheres that revolve around it. Ptolemy proposed something called epicycles to account for the movements Aristotle could not explain in the planets. If you look at slide 5, you can kind of see this crystal sphere. The Earth is at the center, then you got the moon, the sun, you got the planets, and beyond the last sphere is heaven. That's where God and the angels and the saints reign. There are problems with Aristotle's model, though. The planets look like they travel backwards in Aristotle's model. So Ptolemy came up with that solution of epicycles. And if you look at slide 7, if you click on that link and watch that video, it's a really great explanation of how Aristotle and Ptolemy thought. And I think it's 5 minutes long. So you should definitely watch the YouTube clip on slide 11. It'll kind of explain the science behind things. Aristotle taught that there were 4 elements: air, fire, water, and earth. Air and fire are lighter elements and they move up. Water and earth are heavy elements, so they move down. And he believed that the elements could mix with each other. He also believed that a uniform force moved objects until that force was removed, at which point the object's motion ended. So Aristotle believes that objects are naturally at rest, and it takes something to move them. So on the verge of the scientific revolution, these are the things people believed in. So I'm kind of setting you up to see how things change. Why were these ideas accepted? Well, they offered an explanation for what you saw with your naked eye. If you look up at the sky and you look at the planets, they do look like they move backwards certain times of the years. And also, this view of the world fit with the Christian theology that medieval theologians had kind of created. So why did the scientific revolution occur? Well, you have things like the medieval university popping up throughout Europe. You start to get philosophy um, apart from theology, so you get philosophy and mathematics, astronomy, physics. During the Renaissance, a lot of ancient Greek and Roman works are recovered, especially Greek. So people start having a more of a curiosity in figuring out how the world works. We talked about how all of the countries of Europe, or most of them, explored the New World. Exploration. You need new navigational equipment to get to the New World, so that means you have to study the heavens, and just curiosity. Humans are curious. The guy that kick-started the scientific revolution was Nicholas Copernicus. He was a Polish cleric, but he was really interested in how the world works. Um, he went to university. He studied astronomy, medicine, church law, theology, and for him, he was kind of interested in explaining God's creation. A lot of these scientists either belonged to the Catholic Church or were Protestant, so they all believed in God, and they kind of saw their job as a scientist, even though they wouldn't call themselves scientists, they saw their job as explaining the world that God created. Um, Copernicus thought that Ptolemy's interpretation of the universe was wrong because there were inaccuracies, and Copernicus believed God is perfect, so God created the perfect universe. So if there's anything that appears to be wrong, it's not on God's end, it's on humanity's end for not understanding how it works. So he kind of wants to figure this stuff out. He believed that the sun was at the center of the universe, and for 20 years or so, he kind of worked out this theory in the early 1500s. He theorized the stars, the planets, and the Earth revolved around the sun. Um, he left alone some Aristotelian ideas, so he doesn't change everything that Aristotle believed. In 1543, the year that he died, he published On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. In this, he put forth his Copernican hypothesis, which is the idea that the sun is at the center of the universe. Um, it had some implications that Copernicus didn't foresee all of this change that his idea would create. Um, One thing is it meant that the stars were fixed. You don't need the idea of crystal spheres holding the stars up there. The universe is huge. If it takes a year for the Earth to move around the sun and the stars look like they're motionless, that means it's a really big universe. And it destroyed Aristotelian physics. Aristotle thought that the Earth was separate from the heavens. The sublunar plane was where the Earth was, and then the heavenly realm is where all the planets were. But Copernicus basically said, no, Earth is a part of this whole system. It's not separate. Tycho Brahe, he was a Danish astronomer, probably the leading astronomer in Europe. He agrees with Copernicus. With the help of the King of Denmark, he built the best observatory in Europe. He gets support from the Holy Roman Emperor later on. He worked for 20 years making calculations. He would study the stars and the planets and write down what he saw. He compiles a lot of data. He believed that the planets revolved around the Earth, he believed that the planets revolved around the sun except the Earth. He thought everything still revolved around the Earth. So he isn't quite on board with all of Copernicus's ideas. His young assistant, Johannes Kepler, is the one that kind of put together all his data and came up with theories about this. Kepler was a German astronomer and mathematician. His hands and eyesight had been permanently damaged as a child because he had experienced smallpox. He believes the universe is built on mathematical principles. He uses Tycho Brahe's calculations, and he comes up with his famous laws of planetary motion. He also knows that Ptolemy can't explain the motion of the planets. His three laws of planetary motion, they're pretty famous for the time. They're still today. The orbits of the planets around the sun are elliptical, not circular. Planets don't move at a uniform speed in their orbits, and the time it takes a planet to revolve around the sun is related to its distance from the sun. If you click on those links on slide 17, you'll get a quick 3 to 5 minute explanation of each of his laws. And if you like science, they're really cool. Anybody can understand it the way the videos explain it, so you should definitely check those out. He published his first two laws in 1609. Astronomia Nova, his new astronomy. He put forth his third law in 1619 in Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world. Um, Basically, his contribution is that he mathematically proved the relation of the sun-centered universe. So he destroys the Aristotelian Ptolemaic view of the universe. He also experimented with optics and telescopes and completed Brahe's calculations. Galileo Galilei, he's a Florentine mathematician and astronomer. He pioneered the experimental method. Basically, that means the proper way to explore the universe is to conduct experiments and then repeat those experiments until you figure out what is constant. He did a lot of experiments. He did acceleration experiments. He discovered the law of inertia. He built his own telescope so he could see the moons of Jupiter. Um, he published a book, Dialogue on the Two Chief Systems of the World, in 1632. Basically, he supported Copernicus's view of the universe. His book discredited Aristotle and Ptolemy. Most of these guys do. He did get in some trouble with the Catholic Church. He was put in prison but renounced his views, but also renouncing his views. Probably the most famous person in the scientific revolution is Isaac Newton. He's an English scientist, and he explains the forces that control the movement of the planets. He was a student at Cambridge University. He's also deeply religious. He wrote a lot on theology. So he's not just a scientist, he's also a theologian. For a couple years, Cambridge University was shut down because of a plague. Years later, Newton said that that's when he came up with a lot of his ideas. But he came up with ideas about the laws of gravity, centripetal force, acceleration. In 1687, he published his most famous book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. This was probably the most important book of the scientific revolution. It integrated all of these guys we've talked about, all their discoveries. It put forth his three laws of motion, his law of universal gravitation. Newton famously said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulder of giants." So he gave a lot of credit to the people that came before him. And like I said, he was very religious. He said the most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all. And he also said, "What I have discovered is only a drop in the ocean. I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself, and now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me." So even he knows what he's discovered is just the drop in the ocean. There's still a lot more out there. Alexander Pope, who was a poet, he wrote a poem about Isaac Newton, and there was a little ditty in it where it said, "Nature and nature's law lay hid in sight. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." So even people back then realized that Newton had discovered a lot of things about the universe. Um, in addition to finding out scientific truths, people also started to think about, how do we get knowledge about the universe? Francis Bacon was an English politician and writer. Um, during the medieval world and the world of the Greeks, you would basically use speculative reasoning to build theories. So you would think about something and kind of come to a conclusion based on what made sense in your mind. But Bacon's method is something known as empiricism. Basically, you need to observe the natural world and you need to experiment. And then you do that over and over again and you come to a conclusion. You don't just use your mind and think about what might happen. You actually try to see what will happen. Rene Descartes was another famous guy who kind of thought about, how do we know what we know? He discovered that there's a correlation between algebra and math, geometry. So he comes up with analytical geometry. Um, he did a lot of philosophy. He basically said everything can be reduced to matter and mind. So there's a physical world, that's the matter, and there's a spiritual world, that's the mind. This got called Cartesian dualism. He believes God gave mankind a reason, a mind to understand the universe, so mankind should use their reasoning to figure out the truths that God put into the universe. And you might have heard the famous phrase cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Rene Descartes is the one that came up with that. The results of the scientific revolution, there's a formation of an international scientific community. So you got English, French, German scientists. You get state-sponsored scientific academics, academies. London, Paris, Berlin set up academies, other places in Europe. You get a more critical view towards authority. So old-fashioned sources of authority like Aristotle, medieval theology, those things start to get questions. And you also get people, instead of looking up to the heavens to find out, the mysteries of the world, people start looking inward at their bodies to figure out things. Um, Previous knowledge about the human body was also based on Greek thought. Galen was a 2nd, 3rd century AD Greek physician. He held that there are 4 humors or liquids in the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Basically, if you were sick, there was an imbalance of the liquids in you. Sometimes you'll read stories about people in the Middle Ages getting sick, or even during the scientific revolution, so they cut them to bleed them. That was because there was an imbalance, they thought, within your body. Um, Andreas Vesalius was a Flemish physician. He studied the anatomy of the human body by dissecting condemned criminals. His book on the structure of the human body had something like 200 drawings of the human body. So if you look at slide 36, you can see how he really studies anatomy. And during the Middle Ages, artwork it's not very realistic, but art during this period is very realistic as far as like scientifically realistic. William Harvey was an English physician. He discovers the circulation of the blood through veins and arteries in 1628. He discovers that the heart works like a pump. Robert Boyle was an Irishman who founded the modern science of chemistry. He discovered that the elements of nature are made up of small atoms. He had something called Boyle's law, which is the pressure of a gas varies inversely with its volume. He created a vacuum. That was something a lot of people didn't think was possible. So, there's a lot of stuff going on in the scientific revolution. Later on, it leads to the Enlightenment, which is the influential intellectual and cultural movement that we kind of talked about. It revolves around the use of reason, the scientific method, and progress. And I've come up with 3 central concepts of the Enlightenment. Basically, natural science should be used to examine all aspects of life. So this is what is meant by reason. Basically, everything should be submitted to rationalism, basically submitted to reason. Another concept is the scientific method can be used to discover truths about human society. So you might do a bunch of experiments to kind of figure out stuff about the planets or the stars. You can also do experiments to discover laws about human nature. And the third and final concept of the Enlightenment is progress. They believe that mankind was improving themselves. They were getting more modern, smarter, less violent, stuff like that. So progress is going on. The Enlightenment kind of eroded traditional sources of authority. If you think about Christianity, the Bible is revelation from God. So God gave the Bible to mankind. Some people in Europe start to doubt that. A lot of them still believed it, though. Like Isaac Newton believed it. A lot of these scientists did, but some people start to doubt it. Classical texts, such as Greek and Roman writers, that was also a source of truth in the Middle Ages. That starts to go away. And the aristocracy, people used to think that there's a natural hierarchy. Some people are better than others, so you should listen to your superiors. That kind of goes away. And the new authority is human reason. John Locke kind of kickstarted the Enlightenment with his essay concerning human understanding. Basically, he put forth a new theory about how humans learned. He said that at birth, your mind is a blank slate. You haven't perceived anything with your senses yet. So the mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa. The essay concerning human understanding and the mathematical principles of philosophy are kind of the main intellectual inspirations for the Enlightenment. Pierre Bayle was a French Huguenot who basically said that humans can't really know anything, so he kind of pushed skepticism, this idea that nothing can ever be known beyond all doubt. So sometimes the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution are opposites. The scientific revolution is about we can find out truth about the world, we can figure out how things work. Some people in the Enlightenment push the idea that, like, no, we can't really know anything because it comes from our senses and we can't trust our senses. The philosophes are the French intellectuals who basically spread the Enlightenment. Philosophe is just French for philosopher, but they spread the Enlightenment throughout Europe. And France was kind of the center of the Enlightenment. French is the international language. We kind of talked about that before. France is the wealthiest and most populous country in Europe at this time. The philosophes criticize Europe a lot through their secret writings. They write satire. A good example of this is Montesquieu. He's probably one of the most famous philosophes. He writes something called the Persian Letters. There's these two Persian travelers that come to Europe, Uzbek and Rika, and they basically criticize Europe. So Montesquieu was criticizing Europe through these two fictional characters. His greatest work, though, is The Spirit of the Laws. He compares republics, monarchies, and despotisms, basically all the governments that he knew about. This is kind of a really big work in the pioneering of social science. He basically came up with the idea that government is shaped by history, geography, and customs. And his big question is, what will promote liberty and not tyranny? And he came up with a solution. He believed that the separation of powers between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government would protect the people. He really liked England because England has three branches of government: the king, parliament, and a judiciary. Montesquieu and these other guys don't like democracy necessarily because they think the mob can get out of control. The people don't always know what's best. Voltaire is probably one of the most famous philosophes. He has a kind of a grew up middle class person. He has a long career as a writer. He was persecuted in France because he would insult noblemen, so he actually fled to England for a while to avoid prison. He goes back to France and spends time with Madame du Chaillet. She's an aristocratic woman that invites Voltaire to live with her. She's famous because she translated Newton's Principles of Natural Philosophy into French, and I think it's still the translation they use today, so it's really, really a good one. Voltaire loved Newton. Voltaire thinks the best kind of government is the monarchy. He said human beings are very rarely worthy to govern themselves. So, like Montesquieu, he thinks or England has it right because they have a monarchy. He also praised Louis XIV. He corresponded with Frederick the Great in Prussia. He calls for equality, but equality of before the law, not necessarily equality of opportunity. He said the only equality is that by which the citizen only depends on the laws which protect the freedom of the feeble against the ambitions of the strong. Now, Voltaire does believe in God. He sees the universe as a mechanical object. He compares God to a great clockmaker who built the universe and then winds it up and lets it go and it functions on its own. This is kind of known as deism, basically the idea that God built the universe and just let it go. He doesn't involve himself in human affairs. So deists wouldn't believe that you should pray unless it makes you feel good, but prayer doesn't matter because God doesn't intervene. Miracles don't happen because God doesn't intervene. He once said, love God and your neighbor. That's my religion. There is kind of an interesting story about Voltaire. He's having this party where they talk about all these ideas. The French intellectuals would do this, and he basically is bashing Christianity to his fellow intellectuals. And then the servants come in and serve the food, and he prays. And then the servants leave after they serve the food, and everyone's like, you were just making fun of belief in God. Why did you pray? That doesn't make any sense. And he basically said, my servants aren't going to steal from me if they believe in Christianity, so it's a good thing to have religion because it provides rules and structure. Probably the most famous book out of the Enlightenment was the Encyclopedia. This is a collection of some 72,000 articles. It was edited by Denis Diderot and Jean Laurent d'Alembert. Basically, they said, let's collect papers from all the experts. So if you're a scientist, a writer, a priest, a theologian, a skilled worker, you can write an article about something that you're an expert on, and we'll put it in our encyclopedia. Diderot is famous. You may have heard this quote before, but he said, "Man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest." So Diderot is kind of radical for his time. He doesn't like Christianity. He doesn't like monarchy. He thinks both of those things should be gone. Maybe the place that the Enlightenment was most famous after France was in Scotland. David Hume was one of the more famous Enlightened thinkers in Scotland. He put forth the idea of skepticism. Basically, he said the human mind is just a bundle of impressions that originate from your senses. Because all the ideas come from your senses, you can't trust your reason to tell you anything about the universe or about God. His work undermined faith and reason. He wrote an inquiry concerning human understanding. He argued that the human mind can't understand causality or what causes something. He argued that miracles don't happen. One of the examples he uses in his book is if you play billiards or pool, you see the ball hitting the other ball, but you don't actually see the force acting on it. That's invisible, so your senses can't tell you about that. The most famous, I think, Scottish Enlightenment figure was Adam Smith. He was a professor at Glasgow University. He's often considered the founder of modern economics. He's a moral philosopher. He has a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but his most famous book is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Civilizations. It's just called The Wealth of Nations by most people. He kind of asked the big question, what causes wealth? He says you don't need to explain poverty. People are born poor. That's just normal. But how do people and nations get rich? So he put together some ideas. He said self-interest can benefit society. He says the baker of bread, he bakes the bread and sells it to you, not because he wants to feed you, but because he wants to feed himself. He says, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their self-interest. Another idea is, he said, wealth is based on labor, not on possessions of money like gold and silver. So you can create as much wealth as you want by your labor. He said division of labor increases efficiency. He talks about a pen maker, people who make pens or nails. One person can make a limited amount. 10 people can make exponentially more. He also talks about a simple man's coat. Think of a really simple coat that maybe the lowest person in society would wear. Somebody had to raise the sheep. Somebody had to shear the sheep. Somebody had to card the wool, make it smooth. Somebody had to spin it. Somebody had to sew it together. Basically, hundreds of people worked to make that coat for that poor individual. So he said division of labor increases wealth. He also put forth the idea of the invisible hand. This is pretty famous. He says that there's like an invisible hand that governs the economy. When a demand is created, people fill that demand just on their own. Adam Smith did not believe in strong government intervention to guide the economy. He thought people could figure that out on their own by the invisible hand. He also said humans like to trade. And another big idea that kind of went against traditional thinking was that economic growth is not a zero-sum game. Remember how we talked with mercantilism? If your nation wants to get richer, that means other nations have to get poorer because there's only a limited amount of wealth in the world, and it's that pie, and you have to take pieces away from other. Adam Smith says you can actually increase the pie, so you can have more pieces of pie or create a second pie. So increasing your wealth does not decrease someone else's wealth. The Enlightenment spread to the public sphere. You have a lot more books being printed. More people are reading, talking about these ideas, debating. There was something called a salon. This was a regular social gathering where basically it kind of started with rich women from Paris. They would meet in their homes and they would invite philosophers to come talk about these ideas. There's also something historians have called the reading revolution. Basically, you start having a more literate society, and these ideas kind of spread like wildfire. But some Enlightenment thinkers basically attacked the Enlightenment because they did not believe in reason and progress. Probably the most famous is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Um, he believed that civilization corrupts the individual, using reason, rationalization enslaves the individual. He believed that humans are good by nature, but society corrupts and enslaves them. So he's kind of opposite of Thomas Hobbes. In the state of nature, everything is perfect. It's like paradise. He famously said, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." His big book was called The Social Contract. He had two ideas in this: popular sovereignty and the general will. Basically, the general will is this kind of imaginary force that governs society. Immanuel Kant was another famous enlightened thinker. He was a German professor. Um, he wrote an article called "What is Enlightenment?" and he basically said it's the daring to know how the world works. He said, "Have the courage to use your own understanding." In the That's the motto of the Enlightenment: use your own understanding. Don't rely on medieval theologians, religious writings, or Aristotle, people like that. Look after truth yourself. Um, Now, out of the Enlightenment, you kind of have something that's kind of a contradiction, but it's something called enlightened despots. So basically, you have monarchs who are absolutists, but they basically they like some of the enlightened ideas. So they take some of the ideas and apply them to their countries. They don't renounce their absolutism, but they use the enlightened ideals to try to be better rulers. Frederick II of Prussia was an example of this. He promoted knowledge, opened up schools, allowed scholars to publish their finding. He said, I must enlighten my people, cultivate their manners and morals, and make them as happy as the means at my disposal permit." He simplified the laws. He forbade torture. He called himself the first servant of the state. Catherine the Great from Russia is an example of an enlightened ruler. She wanted to westernize Russia. She also did a lot of domestic reforms. She set up a new law code that made the legal system simpler. She restricted torture. She allowed for religious toleration, and she improved education. She also spread the territory of Russia. So these enlightened rulers also are pretty ruthless as well. Maria Theresa of Austria, she limited papal authority, strengthened the bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are seen as a way to modernize Europe. She made the tax system more fair. She reduced the power of lords over serfs. Joseph II of Austria, he abolished serfdom. Um, so that's what some of these people do. But an example, Poland is a country during this period, but it disappears off the map because in the 1770s until the 1790s, Prussia, Austria, and Russia agreed to partition Poland. So basically, over time, Poland is carved up by its neighbors and it disappears from the map. Now, the Polish people, their language, their history are still there, but on the map, you won't see them again until after World War One. But that's kind of a quick overview of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Um, Next time, we'll kind of get into the revolutions of the Americans against Britain and then the French Revolution.